Okay, so let's talk through. Okay, so the first question, just what are oh, sorry, it's not up there. What are four examples or what are four ways that we can control the spread of the disease or any disease? Anyone got some ideas? Cool. So one way we said control or kill vectors, right? That's a good, quick, easy way. It'll only work for, you know, certain types of diseases, but may work. Yep. What were some others? Kane, you got another one? What's one other way we can control the spread of disease? You said controlling or killing vectors is one. What's something else? Yep. So what was? So we say okay. So just on a sec. So you had quarantining was one. Yeah. So we got controlling or killing vectors, quarantining. Antibiotics is one way. Yeah. But not sure. Anyone else? There's one other one that we haven't really touched on so much. So he said, yeah, so killing the pathogen. Now that's either antibiotics, potentially pesticides and other insecticides. Yeah, I agree with that. I think we're, so we got killing the pathogen, controlling or killing vectors, quarantining. What's one other thing or one other way we can stop the spread or control disease? Not necessarily a method, but it's something that we do. What does our body do to try and control spread? Sanitation, yeah. And that'll probably come under the killing pathogens sort of thing to make sure, disinfectants, antiseptics, things like that. Sorry? The immune response, right? So the immune response is a really important way that we can control disease because we've talked a little bit about herd immunity. So the development of a vaccine is a really, obviously, probably the most effective way to control a disease. That takes time and money, and it's not always the simplest response, but the immune response is a really key critical part. Cool. So, what are two ways that we can achieve these things? So, we know malaria is spread by mosquitoes. Okay. So, what are two ways that we might reduce the number of mosquitoes in order to help reduce malarial infection? What do you think we can do to reduce mosquitoes? So we said killing off vectors is one quick and easy thing that we can do. If we know it's spread by vectors, how can we do this? Yeah, so we can protect ourselves using mosquito nets, or our own personal sort of protection stuff. Yeah, yeah, cool. So we really get rid of stagnant water, and that's part of that sanitation idea. Yep. So we know that mosquitoes tend to thrive in stagnant water, tend to thrive in unsanitary conditions. So if we can improve that, that's a really easy, quick way. Yep. Yeah, potentially biological engineering is a really good one. So, we talked a little bit about was it something that they'd done a few years ago, which was release mosquitoes that were in fact, well, they had a certain type of bacteria which were actually resistant to the spread of, I think it was dengue fever that we were talking about. You could do something similar with malaria by engineering, some sort of way, either changing the mosquitoes themselves, and doing these things. So, in terms of reducing numbers, it's probably more on what you were talking about in terms of the stagnant water and sanitation, biological engineering. In terms of reducing the risk, that's probably more the mosquito net stuff. So this is where we, use mosquito nets and things. Okay. How else could we reduce the risk of being bitten by a mosquito? Nets is one thing. Chemicals, yeah. So insect repellents. If you go to any country that has issues with things like malaria, you pretty much always have insect repellent around. Mosquito nets. Yeah, Yeah, we don't, in terms of like stopping us from, yeah, it's more like the breeding. So you just don't go places where there's infestations. No, there's certain regulations around what types of chemicals you can use, and we'll talk a little bit later about one of the chemicals that was banned, well, sort of half banned. We can still use it in some areas, but yeah, you've got to be careful about what types of repellents and things we use. There is issues. Okay, we said that insecticide is one way that we can potentially control the spread of a disease, particularly diseases spread by insects. So, what's one insecticide, and how can it be used to stop the spread? Do we think? Anyone find, or anyone have an idea of any insecticides? We've talked about a couple there, but yeah, we talked about DDT was one, and it's one they sort of started using sort of around the Second World War, which they found had some issues. But yeah, so DDT could be used to kill off insects and flies and mosquitoes and things. Yeah. So mosquitoes, yeah. There you go. So that would work for malaria, I guess. Whether it's helpful. We also use. There are other insecticides, even just the ones that we use. So, like Mortein and stuff at home. It's an insecticide, more of a personal insecticide, but that would work against a range. Yeah, so Mortein kills a lot of things. It'll kill mosquitoes as well, but yeah, it'll kill other stuff, bugs and spiders and a whole range of different things. That's fine. Cool. All right. I know we're going through relatively quickly, but that's fine as well. All right. Let's have a talk about the difference between antiseptic and disinfectants. What's the difference and what's an example of each, do we think? Any ideas? Melody, did you have an idea what the difference might be? Not sure. Anyone want to help out? What's the difference between an antiseptic and a disinfectant? And what would be an example?
I think antiseptic is used to kill the diseases and bacteria and this in. But I don't have to say about antiseptic clear information.
No.
But this disinfectant is used to kill the bacteria on the surface, on the hard surface.
Yep. So disinfectants we'll use on like non-living hard surfaces, tables, chairs, computers.
This disinfectant is mostly used in the hospital.
In hospitals? Yeah, they use a lot of them in hospitals. They're used everywhere, but yeah, hospitals, they'll use disinfectants a lot. Obviously, you want sterile environments, so they use a hell of a lot to clean off pretty much everything. Yep. No? Sam? Yeah, so the main difference is antiseptics, they pretty much do the same thing, but antiseptics are used on the skin or on the body, whereas disinfectants are used on non-living surfaces. So what would be an example of an antiseptic then that we use? You think? What's one you might use? Anyone got one at home? If you cut yourself, what do you tend to use on cuts and things? Potentially, yeah. You could use like an alcohol base. So even the hand sanitizer we have here, the Aquarium stuff, or most of them are alcohol based. Sorry? Olympic thing. I'm sure of that one. It's a range of antiseptics, things like betadine's probably one that you might have at home. That sort of, that brown sort of stuff you put on your skin at home if you have a cut. Betadine, yeah. So it's Betadine, betadine. We also like Dettol can be an antiseptic. I think they put out an antiseptic as well. Even things like alcohol wipes could potentially be antiseptics. There is a lot of crossover. Whereas disinfectants will be things like, bleach is a disinfectant. You might use at home to clean stuff down. There are a range of disinfectants. Ajax and Glen 20 has a disinfectant. There's a range of different disinfectants that you might use at home. Obviously, the best way to stop disease is to stop infection. Obviously, that's the easiest way. You stop from getting infected. This isn't always successful. So once a disease has entered the body, what are some ways in which humans respond to and destroy microbes once they're inside the body? And this is sort of coming back the stuff that we talked about, at the start to midway last term, really. What are some ways, once we get a microbe in our body, what are some ways that we can respond to and destroy microbes? What are some things our body does? Yeah, so we have our immune system. So specifically, what are some things our immune system does to try and fight off disease or kill off microbes? Sorry? So the B cells and T cells, so what would they do? What do they produce to kill off microbes? What's that thing called? Remember the proteins that they give out? Antibodies? Antibodies, yeah, right. So a big part of that acquired immune system is antibodies by the B and T cells. Okay, so one way that we would fight off a microbe would be produce antibodies eventually once we've gone through sort of the immune process. Okay, what are some other ways that we might kill off a microbe, do we think? Yeah, great. So we talked about the phagocytosis, which is really probably our first line of defense really is, that's more of that. Remember we talked about the innate immune system? Like if we cut ourselves, bacteria gets in, the first thing that we really do is use macrophages to essentially eat them through that phagocytosis process. Yeah, and that's a really generic way that we kill off microbes. All right, and then we do other things like our body undergoes fever, so it raises the body temperature potentially. Yeah, so the pyrogens increase our, good memory. Increases our body temperature through fever. And then inflammation is where we do a range, get those cells to the site of infection. But in general, it's things like, so the macrophages will be the sort of first line. Once we've gone through the immune process, then we produce antibodies to try and kill off things. So we're not always successful in preventing infection. Once we're not successful, then we try and fight it off through the immune system process. Now, next question is an interesting one. So first of all, so the question is why are displaced populations more vulnerable to disease epidemics, so the spread of disease? First of all, what do you think we mean by displaced populations, you think? Yeah. So could be potentially remote populations. It could be populations that have had to, that don't have a set home, so maybe homeless people potentially. It could be countries that aren't necessarily, indigenous people, a range of different situations. But I think hopefully you sort of get the idea. Displaced people are people that are not in a very good situation, either because of, they're poor or their country is war-torn potentially, a whole range of reasons why people become displaced. Why do you think those sorts of groups of people tend to be more vulnerable to disease, do you think? Yeah, so potentially it might be lack of nutrition, which would lead to their immune system not being as strong. So if they got infected, it would take hold a lot quicker. It would spread a lot easier. I agree with that. That's a really good point. Anything else? Really good point. Yeah. So one of the biggest things is, if people do get infected, where do they go to get treated? They can't really, right? So they don't have access to medical care. They probably don't have access to testing facilities either. Like early diagnosis is one of the biggest key predictors of stop of spread, and if they don't have access to those things, it's not going to work as well. Yeah. Anything else? A couple of others that I've got. Sorry? Education, yeah. So they might not know how it's spread. So what would happen? That just means that people would probably get together more often. They might spread it easier because they just don't know the transmission, how it's spread. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Yeah, yeah. Yep. Yep. So probably wouldn't quarantine because they don't know what to look for. They don't know if that person's sick or not. Yeah, that's a really good point. I like that. So the fact they don't know how to self-diagnose very easily. I've got one more. Come down to, we talk about sanitation as being a really key thing. Generally, if people are displaced or they're poor or their country has been in turmoil, the sanitation is not going to be as good, which can be really hard on an easy way to spread disease. We talked about the next question a fair bit in terms of vectors. So why can targeting vectors be an effective method of disease control? And what's an example here? We've sort of covered this in other questions, but anyone want to give us a reason why is vector targeting such an effective method? And what's an example? Anyone want to give their thoughts? Why is targeting vectors such an effective method for some diseases, particularly? Okay, any ideas? So why is targeting vectors such an effective method of disease control? And what's an example that might illustrate your answer, do you think?
You mean like attacking fast?
Yeah, so why would we try and stop or kill off vectors? And why is that effective a lot of the time in controlling disease, do you think? Yeah, okay, I like that idea. Yep. So from what I'm hearing, yeah. Anyone want to expand on that a bit more, or I can give my thoughts? Yeah. Yeah. I like that idea too. Similar ideas. So if we think about like the four things that we talked about, right? So controlling or killing vectors was one way. We talked about killing the pathogens. We talked about quarantining, and we talk about the immune response. So if these are like the four main ways that we try and control disease, you'll notice that realistically, the first three of those are about prevention. Yeah, in anything, prevention is a lot better than a cure. It's very hard, and that's what we're seeing now. Once a disease takes control, it is very hard to eliminate a disease after it has spread, right? And this is what we're seeing in places like America, You know, it happened in Italy. China was hit pretty hard at the start. You know, they didn't do the prevention stuff well enough. And what happened? It took hold and it spreads very, very quickly and easily. Yeah. So once the disease gets into a system or into a population, it's very hard to control disease. Okay. Now, the immune response here really is the only one out of these four which is more to do with a cure than a prevention thing, right? Once we're infected, you know, the immune response is really important. These three things are really about prevention. Yeah. So stopping the spread initially, if we can cut it off at the source, that's the most effective way to control disease. Once it takes control, it's very hard to get rid of. So you're right in terms of, sorry? Totally, yeah. This is very, you know, it's a generic sort of idea. You're right. Some diseases are different, easier, trickier. Each disease has their own specific ways that's easier to work with. You know, killing pathogens, so using antiseptics, and this is why we're using hand sanitizers and things. Stop it happening. Stop the spread. So, you know, quarantining is sort of a mix between cure and prevention. It's trying to prevent the spread. Controlling vectors is preventing. So you're right. We target vectors because vectors is the mode of transmission, and that's the easiest way to control disease. Prevent or stop the transmission mode, right? If we can do that, yeah, that's right. Cut it off at the source, stop the mode of transmission. That's the key to almost all disease controllers, to stop the spread and to stop the mode of transmission. Now, you're right. Some diseases spread differently, so the prevention method would be different. So for something like, you know, I don't know, AIDS or HIV, obviously there's no point in controlling or killing vectors. There's no real vector involved. It would be a different prevention method. So it would be, you know, things like protective gear, and we talked about education and all these other things. But yeah, targeting vectors is really effective because we're preventing the disease from spreading in the first place. We're cutting off the transmission method, which is really the key to most disease control. And if you can stop the spread, then you can control the disease. Because once it's taken hold, it's very hard to sort of bring that back. Okay, and so that's mainly why we do that. A couple more, 3 more questions. Number 8, why are not all species of bacteria susceptible to antibiotics, susceptible to penicillin in particular? So why can't we just use penicillin for everything? All bacterial infections, just chuck penicillin at it. You think? Yeah, totally. We talked about potential mutations of bacteria, which would lead to some bacteria just being naturally resistant, which could lead to antibiotic resistance. Okay, that's good. Yep. You know, and just remember, some bacteria will have adaptations to prevent killing by penicillin. Penicillin works in a very specific way. I can't remember which one it is. I don't know. It might, for example, attack the cell wall or the cell membrane. I can't remember exactly. Where was it? It was one over here. I don't know. I had it somewhere written down. But yeah, so penicillin would work by attacking a very specific part of the bacteria. So 2 things, yes, either the bacteria or some bacteria will have adaptations to prevent being killed off in that particular way, or mutations could lead to resistance by antibiotics. So either way, they either have the adaptations to start with, or they might have mutations which would lead to antibiotic resistance. Yeah, I guess there would be some that would have an adaptation. It'd be more like neutralizing the effects, I guess. I mean, it's just it's sort of potentially. They would definitely neutralize the effects of it. Whether you're killing it, it's not really, I don't know if you'd be killing it, but you'd definitely be stopping it from working. We talked about some of the ethical considerations with quarantining. what are a couple of ethical considerations that we can think of with quarantining individuals, do you think? The ideas, ethical issues, why wouldn't you quarantine people? Kane, any ideas? Do you know which question we're looking at? Why not? Close the computer. Well, you obviously can't do two things at once. So close the computer because you're not listening. I don't mind you doing that if you can listen, but you're obviously not, because every time I ask you a question, you don't know what we're looking at. So we're looking at the very last question here, talking about ethical considerations in terms of quarantining people. So what are some ethical issues with quarantining in a disease control situation, do you think? Why shouldn't we do it?
There's no real reason why you shouldn't, but the only ethical fact separate family members.
Potentially, yeah. So maybe stopping family members from seeing each other. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah, we talked about the idea that the big issue people have at the moment is that they're infringing on their civil rights, their civil liberties, you know, the freedom to do, you know, to essentially do what they want. Why should they be stopped doing what they want? Yeah, I agree with that. So, yeah. So how do you control quarantining? Oh, sorry, how do you control people that aren't quarantining? Well, you've got to find them or have some sort of deterrence to not quarantine. Part of that might be a fine. Part of that might be, you know, something else. And you're right. So, yeah, potentially is that against the civil liberties side of things? Yeah, I'd see that as an ethical issue, because then obviously potentially if there are poorer groups or poorer, you know, can they pay the fines versus people that are richer, they don't care so much. So it might sort of marginalize or separate poor and the rich from each other and make it, you know, the divide even greater. You know, it's hard to quarantine people that, you know, it's a lot nicer for people that are rich. You know, you look at these people in America, they have a lot of money and they're quarantining in their big houses and it's nice and luxurious. Try quarantining people that are poorer. It can be a lot more, what's the word? The conditions are a lot harsher generally for people that are poorer in order to quarantine them. So access to food and resources, clothes, you know, it can be very hard on. It can be a lot harder on poorer people than richer people in terms of quarantine. So there's issues there. All right, last question that I just want to touch on was this idea. We talked a little bit about one of the insecticides, DDT. So the chlorodiphenyl tetrachloroethane, whatever it is, it's a big name. DDT. It was used in Australia, but it was banned in 1987. We used it a lot in agriculture. What are some of the side effects associated and the reason it was banned? Look, if you haven't looked it up, doesn't really matter. There was a range of different issues, partly, and a lot of them weren't 100% confirmed, but there were issues with, where are we? They said potentially, so some of the issues with DDT, where are we? Here. So toxicity. They said it was sort of moderately toxic to mammals if eaten. So there was issues with, you know, people tend to eat or ate things that had been exposed to DDT. It was toxic. People tended to get symptoms like prickling sensations in their mouth, nausea, dizziness, confusion, incoordination, potentially vomiting, or tremors if they were exposed to DDT. So there was some issues there. They found that some animals were actually made to be infertile or sterile after they'd been fed DDT, which raised the risk of, would that cause issues with humans. They didn't actually find any reproductive issues in humans or birth defects too much, but it was an idea. There was some concern that it was a carcinogen, so caused cancer. It's been shown to cause cancer in animals, but there wasn't enough evidence necessarily to show that it caused cancer in humans. There are a lot of people that worked in the manufacturing plant that didn't develop cancer. Potentially, they haven't actually shown a correlation between breast cancer and DDT. So it was mainly a lot more of, I guess, the animal side of things. So a lot of mammals exposed to DDT developed tumors and increased risk of liver tumors. So in terms of humans, it wasn't actually too harmful. It was more harmful with the animals, apparently. It was quite persistent in the environment. It didn't go away very quickly, so it stayed around for a long time. So it lasted, the half-life was sort of 2 to 15 years. It just meant that if it was in the soil, it stayed for a very, very long time, which became toxic to a lot of animals in the area. They said it was slightly toxic to birds when eaten. It's highly toxic to aquatic animals also. So if it got into the water system, fish tended to die off a lot as well. Things like frogs, toads, they were also potentially toxic. So it didn't actually have too much of a harm on humans. It was more the wildlife and the environment that it tended to have an issue with. And so they banned it in Australia in '87. There's other insecticides that we use now, but that was just one of those that we used. All right, and that's pretty much all I want to go through in terms of the questions. I just wanted to run through them with you, okay, because there's a second thing I want to go through before